Get ready to hear something genuinely terrifying. Do you think this is the right spot to share this kind of story? I'm at a loss for where else to discuss it, so I figured I might as well share it. This I have informed every living soul on the planet, nearby residents, friends, acquaintances, and haphazard news sources. Never sufficient. My strange sense of duty to tell as many people as possible about what's been going on with me has been difficult to put my finger on. Thus, I present this to you. At the time of this writing, it is November of 2019. The backstory is extensive. What I mean is, it's been at least 7 years, personally. I'm not sure of the actual year, but I'll go with 2012. If I had to guess, I'd say it was 2013. Though, I had a steady career and a girlfriend who is now my fiancée when I was in my mid-20s. It seemed improbable that my life would ever undergo a radical transformation, since I had been working for some time without ever having attended college. That being the case, I didn't see the need to uproot my life and relocate far from my hometown when I was that age. My parents were quite generous and let me use their house as my first residence. My girlfriend and I had just moved in. I would be honoring my family's tradition by preserving this ancient brick house, which my dad received from his parents when he was in his 40s. You can still tell this house is old despite the many improvements it has undergone. The telltale sign is the brick. In our neighborhood, you won't find many brick houses. Hence, it is very noticeable. It feels special, though, and I kind of like that. Regarding our location, the houses are rather far apart because it is a very wooded community. In addition to being the last property on our block, our house has a double border with the woods because we are in the middle of it all. Back there, the forest is enormous, and I do mean enormous. When we were kids, my brothers and I would spend a lot of time exploring that area. No amount of meandering brought us any closer to mapping the entire thing than what we already had. That may seem scary to some, but I've never been afraid of the great outdoors. And I'm also the type of man who liked to remain to himself, so it wasn't a problem for me. I have always had. Therefore, the idea of being alone in my own small world seemed enticing. Anyhow, by the time all this began, my girlfriend and I had already been residing there for a couple of months. During the winter, at some point, I am unable to pinpoint the precise month. I can only tell you that it snowed. On Sundays, the one day of the week when I could sleep in. It was after 8 in the morning. I observed something strange as I got in my pickup truck to enjoy a coffee, as I do every Sunday morning. There appeared to be a footprint track in the snow in the driveway, adjacent to my vehicle. My initial assumption was that my girlfriend had awoken earlier than me and for some reason emerged to the driveway. I couldn't help but think that was impossible the more I observed my surroundings. The tracks came from the woods since. They went through the gap in our side yard fence and across my front yard. Not only that, but the trail didn't go near our house, so my girlfriend couldn't have made them. I was really bewildered as I stood there. The trail ended at the driver's side door of my car. It did not go round our house or up to any of the windows. I knew someone had come straight from the forest to my vehicle because of that, without deviating from the path that led directly back into the forest. Weirdness ensued. My partner was definitely not to blame, but I did end up asking her about it later that day. It happened so long ago that I don't recall much more than that. I wish I could tell you more about the first instance. The subsequent event occurred at least 2 winters later, because my Seahawks lost the Super Bowl that year to Tom Brady's Patriots. I vividly recall that it was 2015. I got out of bed and walked to my vehicle that morning. Although I can't be sure, I believe it was a weekday. Something was obviously incorrect the second I went outdoors. Footprints were all over the place. I mean along the house's perimeter, in the driveway, close to each and every window. They covered the yard entirely. Even though I usually keep my cool under pressure, I would be dishonest if I claimed I was totally composed at that precise moment. I didn't want to put my girls in harm's way, but I was too busy and late for work to carefully examine the prints. There wasn't much I could do in the little time I had, other than dash around the house and yard to make sure nobody was hiding on the property. I sent my girlfriend a text message explaining what had happened so she wouldn't freak out as I pulled out of the driveway. Because I couldn't stop thinking about the situation, I left work early that day. My partner had made some unexpected findings by the time I came home. She said one of the trails had been nagging her all day, and as soon as I arrived, she waved me into the yard. I didn't understand what she was saying at first, but eventually I got it. Shoe impressions were not to be found among the footsteps. I felt foolish for missing it at first. The person or people who left these tracks were likely barefoot. I couldn't find the right words. Who in their right mind would brave the sub-zero temps to go barefoot? The prints appeared to be little more than to human feet. Despite my girlfriend's suggestions that it might be an animal, we dialed my dad's number from inside the house, but he insisted he'd never seen anything like that in his many years there. He gave me orders to get my gun and find out who had left the footprints. I was aware that it was my responsibility, even if I really disliked doing it. She wanted to contact the authorities, my girlfriend. However, I was aware that doing so would be fruitless. I didn't believe trespassing warranted a search, and we didn't have any proof of a crime either. She consented after I threatened to contact the authorities if I discovered anything in the forest. As I mentioned earlier, the forest is its own universe, so I vowed to return the moment the sun began to set. My weapon was slung over my shoulder as I made my way out. I was following the route for what felt like half an hour when I spotted something out of the ordinary. In an unexpected turn of events, the track forked into directions. I was confused about which one to do first. I had no idea that was even feasible. Someone had to have gone back and left the trail for me to follow, but then an even more terrifying idea occurred to me. Might there be more than one person out there all this time? I thought I had been following only one person. Even though the idea of more than one person had never crossed my mind before, it was enough to startle me. The thought that I could be outnumbered made me feel uneasy before choosing to turn around. I remained there for a short bit longer. The sun was setting nevertheless. Those footsteps kept popping into my head as I walked back. If two individuals were attempting to follow the same path, I would have known it. The individual in the rear could not have succeeded without making a mistake. My next thinking was that someone might have walked backwards from further into the forest, to give the impression that there were two persons present the entire time. After that, the fact that it could have been a single individual who retreated is an obvious option. Perhaps someone had been fatigued from carrying another person and decided to stop. It was hard for me to decide which of the several explanations was the most unsettling. We did eventually contact the authorities that evening, but they informed us they couldn't do much without concrete proof of a crime. Just as I had anticipated, I informed my girlfriend that I would be returning to the woods the next morning, but there were no further footprints to trace due to the heavy snowfall that night. There was absolutely nothing we could do to alleviate my girlfriend's evident fear. Thankfully, that was the only incident that winter, to be more precise. A few years passed with no further developments. I would even go so far as to claim that we had completely disregarded the matter. Since then, a great deal has transpired. While we were preoccupied with other matters, my girlfriend and I became engaged around that period. If the narrative ended there, though, I wouldn't be writing this. This whole thing didn't happen more than a year ago. The new year had barely passed. Footprints were all over my property when I woke up one morning in January. All the memories flooded back at once. In our bedroom, my fiancée sobbed and asked whether we would ever be able to escape this nightmare. What should I tell her? I was at a loss when I did it again. It was even worse. Footprints led to my shed, and several tools were gone. What else did those individuals do? Only God knows. Fury consumed me. I contacted my pal Theo by phone. I briefed him on the issue and asked him if he could lend me a hand. He's a big guy who loves the outdoors and has a lot more experience hunting than I have. That's why I needed his assistance. A few hours after we agreed, he drove over to my apartment. My fiancée was absolutely terrified, but I assured her that Theo and I could take care of everything. Realizing we might be in the elements for quite a while, we bundled up and prepared to endure the weather. We could see in low visibility thanks to Theo's extremely costly thermal scope for his AR-10, so I wasn't concerned about the darkness. This time, although I would still be blind from not investing that much in hunting gear. It was reassuring to know that at least one of us could see. I will admit that I was somewhat terrified as we left. Theo and I were quite chatty as we walked for the first half an hour, but after that, we hardly spoke at all. The gravity of the situation seemed to strike us simultaneously. At the time, I prayed to God that I hadn't gotten Theo into anything bad. At some point thereafter, the tracks again divided into two sets of footprints. However, the exact duration is uncertain. Initially, we proceeded along the left-hand path, but eventually, it came to a sudden halt. We turned around and headed back to the fork, where Theo said that whomever had gotten off the rails clearly didn't want anyone following them. I preferred not to dwell on it, so we continued silently following the footprints. It's true what they say, we wasted precious daylight going around in circles, because we hit at least 3 further dead ends. I was amazed that someone could walk backwards so precisely, that a set of footsteps didn't appear to have been trodden on more than once. It wasn't like anything you'd normally see. One positive aspect, which Theo brought to my attention, was that the dead ends probably indicated that we were pursuing a single individual. As time went on, darkness descended. By that time, we had gone quite far into the forest. My immediate environment was completely foreign to me. For very some time after that, the trail imprints remained in the same direction. Whoever we were after had likely given up after encountering so many dead ends, according to Theo. After about 5 more minutes, the tracks began to get substantially deeper. A closer approach was possible. A second set of footprints materialized at the same time as the first. We were likely following the individuals, and Theo said under his breath that he had been mistaken. Theo would periodically check his scope, as the sun had nearly set. If it weren't for Theo's scope, I'll admit that I would have turned around despite the snow's improved visibility. There was total quiet as we walked. Suddenly, Theo's arm brushed against my chest and beckoned me to halt. He caught my gaze, and his scope allowed him to see directly ahead. I continued staring at him as I couldn't tell what he was staring at. His expression betrayed his anxiety. He had never been so motionless before. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally walked over to the closest tree and knelt down. Without even wondering why, I went along with it. Once again, he peered through his scope, and I noticed a little quiver in his palm. 20 more seconds of dead quiet. I reached out and gently touched his shoulder because the tension was killing me. I had to suppress a scream when I stared through the scope as he silently passed me his firearm. For shadowy forms drew closer together amid the snow. It didn't take long for me to figure out that they weren't bears after my initial assumption. They were real people. There were 4 of them. 2 were big and stooped, and the other 2 were little. A neighboring tree supported the smaller ones. The creatures swiveled their heads wildly as they devoured their prey. Without thermal vision, I couldn't discern any features, but I could discern that they were nude. Witnessing this sight was the most horrifying experience of my life. Eventually, the larger creatures lifted the smaller ones from the tree and carried them on their shoulders. They then proceeded to venture further into the forest. Theo and I remained motionless beneath that tree for what seemed like an eternity, ensuring that the creatures couldn't hear us. Hours later, when we returned to the house, I was taken aback to see that my fiancée was still wide awake. She wanted to know what we discovered and told me that I was keeping her from sleeping. She was still horrified, even though I informed her with as little detail as possible. That evening, we contacted the authorities, who informed us that they had conducted an early morning search of the woods. We were able to aid the authorities in their search because Theo volunteered to spend the night. The cops, with our assistance, searched the forest first thing in the morning, but they abandoned the mission after a few hours since the footprints were partially obscured. My fiancé insisted that they continue their search, but they refused to authorize such a massive operation due to a few misplaced equipment. I get it. I just didn't feel like anything was resolved. Things were clear to both Theo and me. My boyfriend and I are going to be really anxious if those people return. Again, when winter comes, we haven't been able to initiate the process of relocating, but it is something we're very contemplating. To be honest, I'm confused. As I mentioned before, I have informed everyone I can about our situation. In fact, it has persisted for quite some time. My neighbors have never had anything similar happen to them, and I don't understand why. No idea who or what is targeting my home. I have no idea what they want. Others have warned me that I am in imminent danger, while others of my pals insist that they are harmless. For now, I'm not sure what more to do, but I'm considering trying to block off access to my yard from the surrounding forest. It would be great if we could go shortly. I resolved to hike a significant portion of the PCT last summer. Traveling on foot has always been one of my favorite things to do. Parking my car at the section's end, taking a ride to the trailhead, and hiking back over the period of about a week and a half was my straightforward plan. It seemed simple enough when we were younger. Everything went according to plan throughout the first several days. It was just what I had imagined the route to be. Countless miles of majestic trees and meandering trails slicing across tranquil scenery. Since I am in quite good health, I am able to hike for long periods without resting. Of course, I didn't want to hike in the dark, so I had to set up my tent every night so I could sleep. Since I was a kid, I've always thought it was best to blend in, especially when hiking alone. For that reason, every night when I set up camp, I would stray slightly from the track. That was how I decided it would work best, made it less likely that an unknown person would happen onto my campground by accident. Everything was going swimmingly until the third night. But the reason I'm taking a long break from hiking and from exploring the wilderness in general is what I'm going to reveal to you. I had this strange feeling that something was awry when I woke up in the middle of the night. You have an unspoken intuition like that, but you know it's wrong to disregard. In my tent, I surveyed the area. I decided to look about the campsite as everything seemed normal inside. I took out my gun, a flashlight, and the tent's zipper. It seemed like nobody was around, at least no one that caught my eye. I went back to my tent and began to examine my bag. I then realized that my wallet had vanished. For a while, I assumed I had just lost it, perhaps tossed it outside the tent or buried it among my belongings. However, after thoroughly destroying everything, it became evident that someone had stolen everything belonging to me, including my identity, money, and credit cards. But how on earth is that even feasible? Did someone break into my tent with the sole purpose of taking that one item before fleeing? Though it seemed implausible, I finally accepted the fact that it was possible that I had misplaced it on my own, since it had happened so unexpectedly and was so out of character for me. However, from that point on, things deteriorated further. I began to realize more and more things were missing over the following several days. Things that are little and apparently unrelated. A Swiss Army knife, a lighter, and some energy bars. I had a feeling I wasn't only losing track of things, my possessions had been stolen, even though I tried not to believe it at first. By the fourth day, it was clear someone was pursuing me. On that section of the path, there was no mobile service, so I couldn't even try to contact someone for help. I had the thought of going back, but then I realized that at most I would be saving a few days. It was impossible for me to travel in either direction without stopping for sleep, but I also didn't feel safe setting up camp in the middle of the woods. While someone was obviously trying to follow me, everyone involved ended up losing. I tried to keep my cool and remind myself that I had a good cause to bring out my rifle. Then it hit me. Why hadn't that individual taken my weapon that night? I hoped they wouldn't come back, so I tied my tent tight from the inside. It was almost like they were intentionally playing a joke on me. I stayed up for what felt like an eternity, but I was so exhausted that I dozed off in the end. However, my strategy was successful, as I discovered no evidence of any intrusion into my tent upon awakening the following morning. The paranoia had fully set in by that point, though. Every second of my hike was excruciating because of how lonely it felt. Even though I've never suffered from anxiety before, I can assure you that the following few days were the worst I've ever felt. Just try to put yourself in my shoes, ignoring the fact that someone is probably following close behind. I have no choice but to keep hiking. I was falling apart under the weight of constant worry. My thoughts began to wander for reasons I cannot fathom. The sound of rustling bushes was quite innocuous. The second I cocked my head, A shadow that had been squirming on the periphery of my field of view disappeared. The delusions intensified. Honestly, I don't recall most of them, however. This stands out the most. Walking, I felt myself step into a puddle that was ankle-deep, nearly tripping me. The sensation of the icy water soaking my sock accompanied the audible splash, however. Upon lowering my gaze, I beheld an entirely parched earth. I was taken aback as I stood there. That was really authentic. I was compelled to proceed along the path nonetheless. Even while the days were terrible, the evenings were much worse. Even after securing my tent and sleeping with my weapon at my side, my uneasiness persisted. I had to spritz some cold water on my face to get myself to relax once. Once that happened, the hallucinations diminished significantly, if they had persisted. I'm unsure of my next move. When I awoke the following night, I could hear people wandering all about my tent. I silently snatched my rifle, ready to face whatever was there, but my body froze with terror. The sounds of footfall eventually dissipated into the forest, but after that, I was never going to be able to sleep again. I was in such a frenzied state as the sun rose that I could hardly tie my gear as I frantically packed up camp. Another night would be too much for me to bear. I was incredibly close to my car, perhaps within a day and a quarter's hike, or even closer if I hiked faster. That night, I made up my mind that I would not be stopping for sleep, that I would run through the night in order to escape the desolate path without delay. For hours, I hiked at a pace that my body could handle. I clenched my jaw and kept going as the sun began to go down, refusing to stop to set up my tent. I was so near when it was completely dark. I would say no more than 2 hours. With my weapon and lights at the ready, I continued on my way. I began to question the wisdom of my choice. It was more challenging than I had anticipated, and I had never trekked at night before. Just the thought of it was terrifying. I persisted, making an effort to maintain a regular breathing rate. After what felt like an eternity, I was finally approaching. Later on, I became aware of its sound. I thought I heard feet coming up behind me. I turned back and swung my flashlight around. To my surprise, I caught sight of something skulking behind a tree. I swung my gun toward the tree as my adrenaline surged. Using a loud voice, I insisted that they emerge. Someone advanced toward the scene. I am not exaggerating when I say that what I saw was the most savagely ugly thing I had ever seen. Even though it was undoubtedly a human, the sight before my eyes was indescribable. I didn't even notice he was missing my shorts. He was wearing nothing but them. There were multiple scratches on his skin, and he had hair all over his face. Even though I was aiming my weapon at him, he began to approach me. He was next to me as I quickly tapped off a warning round. In response to the noise, he ran back into the forest at a breakneck pace. My mind was blown. I swiftly pivoted and sprinted away, not wasting a single second more. When I finally emerged from the forest, I had already locked my car doors and dialed 911. Upon their arrival, they informed me that I should not remain. It wasn't necessary to inform me twice. It was that night when I left. The hallucinations were the most insane aspect of it all, in my view. It never occurred to me that such strong hallucinations might be conceivable. It will be quite some time before I venture out on foot again, but when I do, you won't find me wandering alone. Anyone considering a hike along the Pacific Crest Trail should exercise extreme caution and bring a handgun, in my opinion. I find myself reflecting on this event on a regular basis. I apologize ahead of time if I forget anything important regarding the story I'm going to tell. Quite a few years ago, my best friend told me this on several occasions. The story is so disturbing that you can't get rid of it no matter how many times you hear it. The father of my best friend worked as a tree saw operator for a logging company. A tree saw, for the uninitiated, is a gigantic implement for felling enormous trees and sawing them to precise lengths. For his employment, he had to put in long, hard hours, frequently in the remote northwest woods by himself. Because his logging crew's compensation was tied to the quantity of trees felled, rather than the amount of hours worked, he frequently pushed himself to work 16 to 20-hour days in order to complete assignments as rapidly as possible. The remainder of the crew would arrive once him and his colleague finished their task. to remove the downed trees and bring them to the mill. While he did most of his job alone, he did spend some time with his tree saw operator friend Griffin. When they were on separate sides of the same construction site, they relied on radios to keep in touch. Griffin and my friend's dad were sent to a distant mountaintop construction site a few years ago, clearing a path large enough for the company's vehicles and equipment to reach the location. Took more than 3 weeks. They had already reached a very barren section of the mountain when they started working. They had made excellent progress for the first 10 days, when they began to hear unusual conversation on their radios. In the beginning, there were only muted, incomprehensible whispers that were accompanied by static. They experimented with changing channels, but the noise persisted. That is very weird. As any user of a regular radio can tell you, no one should be able to track your channel switching movements. The voices grew clearer as they ascended the mountain, though they were only able to pick out bits and pieces of discussions. They reached a consensus that the overall tone sounded turned off. According to my friend's dad, there were parts where it sounded somewhat casual, but the text was completely incomprehensible. Along with this, they began to notice peculiar evidence indicating previous visitors had been there. Unorganized trash cans, tracks in the ground, and improvised tents of varying sizes. As I mentioned earlier, their location was extremely inaccessible due to its extreme remoteness. This is why the findings were so disturbing. Those people ought to have been kept down. Perhaps someday, just off a trail, Griffin found a tent and summoned my friend's dad to come get it. So they set out to find out. A duffel bag with the most horrifying items ever discovered and one sleeping bag were inside. Several sets of underwear for children, rope, duct tape, and shabby drawings of child abuse. Photos of a recently picked apple suggested the owner had been there not long ago. Griffin was in a hurry to get everything packed and go. Their father, ever the workaholic, was a friend of mine, and he told them to get the work done. They continued working after agreeing to restrict radio contact to only emergencies. Throughout the night, they remained seated in the camper, consumed by an overwhelming sense of fear. Once more, the radio squealed to life, and this time they managed to discern fragments of a discourse between two males. While gathering water and firewood, they engaged in banal conversation. The thought that these guys might have some sort of connection to the tent really frightened my friend's dad. Griffin showed little emotion, but my friend's dad was completely overwhelmed. The father of one of my friends chose to confront them the following night. He seized the radio and wanted to know their identities and activities as soon as he overheard them discussing collecting bush for a fire. In an instant, both the soldiers and the radio went dead silent. Almost more unsettling than the noise was the complete lack of sound. The fact that my friend's dad had made an announcement about their arrival irritated Griffin, and they had a short disagreement before choosing to take matters to a higher level the following day. At about midnight, Griffin roused my friend's dad from his slumber by muttering that the camper was being approached. From outside, he was greeted by the gentle crunch of footfall on the gravel outside. With his heart racing, he reached for his rifle, only to find that it was empty. His ammo was somewhere he couldn't place. Griffin had no weapons, and considering their whereabouts, the thought of contacting the authorities was absurd. Upon hearing the jiggle of the camper door handle, they both froze in their seats. The door swung open somewhat, but not all the way in. Without a stepladder or ladder, their camper dangled precariously above the ground. After that, the itching began. The exterior of the door has been scratched long and deliberately. A painful for minutes elapsed. At last, Griffin received a nod from my friend's dad, who was clearly going to go take a look. With a flashlight held in his trembling palm, he cautiously approached the entrance. The moment he got close to the door, it swung open and a knife slashed across his face. He was in excruciating agony. As he stepped out of the camper, he slammed onto the ground. A man piled on top of him and pressed the knife against his neck before he could even recover. Some time later, a second man showed up and started kicking him in the head. Grasping the man by the knife, Griffin jumped out of the camper without hesitating. After tackling the first man, Griffin helped the second man get to his feet and chase after him as he dashed into the night with They vanished into the woods. They drove 2 hours to the closest hospital after Griffin helped my dad's friend get back into the truck. Not good. His vision was irreparably impaired due to a nasty slash across his eye and a behemoth of a face. Despite reporting the incident to the authorities, the situation remained unchanged. A member of the logging crew was discovered, bound, gagged, raped, and killed in a ditch 2 weeks after the remainder of the crew completed the task. No one was ever taken into custody. His battle with post-traumatic stress disorder (PTSD) continues to this day. Because of the disfigured pupil in his right eye, he can't stop thinking about that fateful night. Since then, I guarantee he hasn't slept soundly because of my friend's dad's experience. I've had a lifelong fear of being in dense forests. I can only pray that he is doing well because I haven't heard from my pal or his dad for years.